Thank you to Dean Conlon, to the members of the faculty, distinguished guests, the beautiful band, proud parents, and especially thank you to the beautiful class of 2011. I'm really honored to be here to celebrate the hard work you've done, all of the well-deserved accomplishments that you have this year. You have so much for which to be proud, so much to dream. And Peggy's actually wrong that there's no connection between my family and Notre Dame. It might not be as obvious, but as she said, I come from a very large Austrian Catholic immigrant family for whom football loomed large in our mythology. And my father, Bob Novogratz, was actually on the last undefeated Army team, class of 1958. And so as the mythology goes in our family, in 1957, Army played Notre Dame at Memorial Stadium in Philadelphia in front of 100,000 people. And if you can imagine my grandmother in her house dress with her black lace-up shoes, having come as a full-fledged adult to the United States, she watched the game with real trepidation, and it looked like Army was going to win. And in the last few seconds of the game, Monty Stickles kicked a field goal, and Army lost. And my grandmother that night took my father aside and said, "You know, Bobby, I knew actually they were going to lose. Army was going to lose today because I've never seen so many people at a football stadium saying the rosary before." So now it's the next year, the stakes are really big. It's 1958. Army's almost hitting their undefeated record. And 36 Novogratzes and friends pile into cars from this little cement town, Northampton, Pennsylvania, and they drive halfway across the country to watch their native son play. And my grandmother takes a tour of the campus and comes back the night before the game and says, "You know, I really love you and I'm rooting for Army, but I just don't think there's any chance that Army's gonna win because everywhere I go, there's a priest saying Mass." And so, as it turned out, Army won. And my Uncle Ed was so excited because my grandmother had so convinced him that this was the impossible that he literally jumped over the fence and over the shoulders of cadets to give my father a big bear hug. And we've held that story as myth for what Notre Dame really means in this family and how the Fighting Irish are such a beacon for not only immigrant families, but for individuals who really believe in this dream, that this combination of scrappiness and determination, of inclusivity and of faith can really lead to extraordinary change. So you see, it doesn't matter if you're connected by blood to having gone to Notre Dame. I think this is a place that has enough mythology that it can impact people all around the world. Every one of you graduates chose to come to a business school that declares as fundamental to its value system values like human dignity and concern for the poor and vulnerable. These are not words you typically associate with business, and yet they must become fundamental and central to the way we think about using as a business as a tool for changing problems in the 21st century. And so you're so lucky to be coming from a place that builds it from the inside out. And every one of you, through your studies at Notre Dame and through your experiences, understands that even more than the tools of business, we need to develop in ourselves the skills of leadership, the quality of leadership. And as Dean Conlon told me before, that Notre Dame really focuses on building not only your minds, but also your hearts. And I was thinking about that, and it reminded me of one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Martin Luther King, who says that love without power is anemic and sentimental, and that power without love is reckless and abusive. And so may you all, as you move through whatever it is that you choose to do in the world, walk with that sense of developing operational and financial skills so that you can really manage and execute, but always move from a place of what we call moral imagination, this idea that you need to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and really build solutions from that perspective. So now that you have your degree or will soon, from Notre Dame, what will you do? Every commencement speaker that I've ever heard tells you to start with your passion, follow your bliss, do what is closest to your heart. And it's true, even though it might sound trite. But even more surprisingly, it sounds easy. And what's really been striking to me lately is how many young people, as well as people in their 50s and 60s, call me, email me, and say, either I really want to follow my purpose, but I haven't figured out what it is yet, or they say, I know what my passion is, but it feels too hard to start now. My boyfriend or my girlfriend thinks I'm a lunatic, my parents think I'm ruining my career, my current boss thinks I would be crazy, and the places that I would have to go don't feel safe. But if I've learned anything in my life, it's that life isn't safe and that there is no halfway. One of my favorite quotes from literature was written by a woman named Tilly Olson. She was a Russian immigrant who wrote in the 1950s and 60s in the segregated South. And there's a scene in her short story called Oh Yes, where there's a white mother looking at her daughter who's befriended an African-American little girl going to a mostly all-white school. And she knows that the little girls both are being marginalized. And she says, as she's seeing the girl, better immersion than to live untouched, yet how will you sustain? Better immersion than to live untouched. Better to give something everything you have inside of you and fail than to play it safe and never know what you really could have been, never know what you really could have done. And so as you look into our increasingly complex and growing world, what will you decide to do with your life? On which problems will you work? I think one of the biggest problems for your generation is that you have so many choices. And I know a lot of people who are always looking to keep their options open. So they'll do one thing as long as they can, it will lead to another thing. But I worry that for those individuals at the end of their life, they may end up with a lot of options, but nothing else. And so I would tell you all to commit to something bigger than yourselves. It might not be the right thing at first and you can course correct, but it's better to fail and change than to not try. As Peggy said, I started my own career in international banking, and I actually ended up loving everything about it, though I didn't think I wanted to be a banker. I loved the way money could be invested into businesses, and suddenly you'd see jobs and new ideas coming to fruition. I loved the way numbers could tell a story about a company. But this was in the early 1980s, and I ended up spending my time in 40 countries, but a lot of it in Latin America, where we were making loans to the elites who would often move the money right offshore to the Cayman Islands. And I noticed that the middle class and the poor couldn't even walk through the doors of the bank. And so I decided that I was going to go to Africa and to try my hand at this new thing called microfinance, which nobody knew or understood. And just as I hear so many young people saying today, those fears are truth. My uncle told me I was destroying my life. My mother told me that only homely nuns should go to Africa to try to save the world, and that I was clearly never going to be married in my life. And my boss offered me this really big job that made it very difficult to walk away from. But something inside me knew that I had to do it. And yet, rather than be rewarded for making this great, brave decision, which is how I looked at it, all I met when I first moved to Kenya and then the Ivory Coast was failure. In Kenya, I was asked to help analyze the whole financial structure of this microfinance organization, and I spent hundreds of hours on it, and then the executive director burned my work and threw it away. And in the Ivory Coast, I was told in no uncertain terms that I was neither wanted nor welcomed and threatened with voodoo and poisoning. So it was intense. And yet, despite the fact that I felt like nothing but a failure, I started to realize that I was learning a lot, not only about the world, but about myself. I was learning about development and how so often we go into new places thinking that we have all the answers for people, rather than having the humility to listen, and that I, who didn't see myself in this way, was one of those kinds of people. But all of that failure finally landed me in Kigali, Rwanda, where I had another very important lesson, which was that sometimes a small group of people really can change the world. And I found 5 Rwandan women, and together we started the first microfinance bank in that country. Still exists today. And it was extraordinary. But 5 years after I left the country, life brought me another turn, and I opened up the newspaper one day. I was working in New York City, and I read about the Rwandan genocide. And I had no idea what had happened to the institution that I had worked on building, nor the people that I had come to love. I decided to go back, and I did. And I discovered that the women with whom I had started this institution ultimately carried out every conceivable role of the genocide, from being killed in the first hour, to watching their families being murdered, to actually being one of the major perpetrators. Our first executive director ended up being the Minister of Justice under the genocide regime and was responsible for the killings of 800,000 people. And I decided I wanted to dig in deeper, understand what it really means to be human. And the most extraordinary moments were sitting knee to knee in the Kigali prison with Agnes, our first director, where I had to admit to myself that sometimes monsters do exist, but they don't necessarily look like we think they do. In fact, I've learned that monsters are sometimes the broken pieces in ourselves, the fragments, the insecurities, the places where we feel most ashamed. And in times of economic peril, in times of turbulence, it becomes very easy for demagogues to prey on those fragments and sometimes make us do terrible things. But through this experience, I also learned to learn at the edge, to recognize that sometimes the universe throws things at you that you had no idea you would be learning. In fact, with all the skills that our schools teach us, what we find so often in life is that people don't behave the way they think they should behave, nor does the world operate in the way that we think we should. So if we're not constantly learning, we're going to miss it. At the most fundamental level, my experiences in Africa also taught me that dignity is more important to the human spirit than wealth. And essential to a world where all of us can live with dignity is this idea that dignity means choice and dignity means opportunity. It makes having the ability to solve our own problems. I'd also discovered, as Peggy said, that neither markets nor the nonprofit sector alone was ever going to solve big problems of poverty. So after 15 years of apprenticing, and I would encourage you all to think of yourself as apprenticing, putting new tools all the time in your toolbox, I decided I wanted to create a different kind of organization in 2001. We called it Acumen Fund. It was this idea that capital exists along a spectrum, and that if we could invest charitable money, not just give it away as handouts, in those entrepreneurs who saw poor people as full-bodied human beings and built solutions from that perspective, and if we left that money for a really long time, patient capital, 8, 10, 15 years, and provided, in addition to capital, a lot of management assistance, trust building, showing up, maybe we could create better solutions than what we were too often seeing in the world. And as today, we've invested $60 million in 50 companies. But we've helped create over 35,000 jobs. And to walk into a company like A to Z Manufacturing in Tanzania and see 8,000 jobs, women that are creating 30 million life-saving malaria bed nets a year, recognizing that means 20% of all manufacturing in Tanzania, you start to see that we really can change the world. Or investing in a nine ambulance company in Bombay, a city of 17 million people, and thinking at some level, are we being too idealistic? But then a few years later, seeing that company grow to having 385 ambulances, the largest ambulance company in India, based on the ethos of no corruption and service for all, you realize that you can change the world. I want to give an example that talks about one individual, because you might be one of these individuals, and it starts in the state of Bihar, India. Despite India's great success, if you took Bihar and put it on the African continent, it would be the second poorest country on the continent and the second largest. 90 million people who earn on average $200 a year. The government of India had declared 65 million people living in 25,000 villages economically impossible to reach with conventional electricity. So enter one young entrepreneur, trained at the best schools in the world, understood his privilege, came from Bihar, was working in the semiconductor industry in LA, and he decided he was going to go back and he was going to find a different solution. And like me, when he first started, he failed. He tried solar, too expensive. He tried jatropha, biofuel, it didn't work. And finally, he looked around himself and saw that he was standing in the middle of the rice belt. And was there a way that he could convert rice through gasification into electricity? And for a couple of years, we worked with him, and we couldn't make the business plan work. But ultimately, there was another innovator in government. So you don't have to just go into business or the nonprofit sector. There's government there. And they worked out a 30% subsidy for every plant that he built. And today, he's in 65 villages, electrifying 150,000 homes. And the government has a model for what it could take to bring electricity to places that the world had written off. That's the kind of thinking that we need. I'm so often asked these days to talk about the future of capitalism. Is it broken? Do we need a new model? And I think that that's the wrong question, because on the one hand, capitalism has raised 400 million people out of poverty in the last 15 years. But on the other hand, we're seeing this incredible disparity growing between rich and poor. 2% of us own 50% of the world's assets, and 50% of us own 1% of the world's assets. And what's different about the world today is that we can see each other. And we as human beings don't make decisions about ourselves based on absolutes, but rather we base our decisions about who we are based on where we are relative to each other. And so the question isn't, is capitalism broken? But the question is, can we build in ourselves the qualities of leadership that make us do the things because they're the right thing to do and not just because they're legal? When I look at all of you, I see an extraordinary generation. And I get to interact with you and people like you all the time. I think you're the best generation, certainly that I've seen in my lifetime. You're idealistic and you're pragmatic. You understand that working on these issues is not about just doing good, but it's about taking on some of the most intellectually challenging problems of our time. In one of his famous poems, the Irish poet Seamus Heaney talks about moments when hope and history rhyme. And when I look at all of you, I see that hope in all of your faces. And there is so much that I wish for you on this day of your graduation. I wish first and foremost that you commit to something bigger than yourselves, to listen to that voice inside of you no matter what the world outside says, and follow what it is that makes you feel alive and full of sparkle, for these are the things that will allow others' light to shine as well. I wish that you dare to take roads less traveled, to recognize that all around us are enormous opportunities, too often disguised as insolvable problems. And in the end, all we have is ourselves to solve those problems. May you have the courage to try to do what you never thought you could, and never, ever let yourself be daunted by failure, because that's part of the game of change. And instead, when you fail, know that it will reveal real truths about yourself and the world. And may you always learn at the edge. 10 years after I started Acumen, more than a quarter century after I started working on issues of poverty, I feel I'm still learning every single day. And I believe that when you look around the world and you see those people in their 80s and 90s who are still full of sparkle, it's because they keep that sense of childlike curiosity. This week marks 50 years since the Freedom Riders came down from the privileged schools in the North and went to the South to meet with Dr. Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement. And I've been thinking about the courage that they took on for social justice. And I know a lot of people that were on those buses. I also know a lot of people who were in university and graduate studies then who didn't get on the buses. And when I talk to them, they say they didn't know what a big deal it was, but that they wished they had. And those people that were on the buses, even if they played a really small role, know that they were part of making history. And all of us stand on their shoulders. And in so many ways, when I look around the world today, I think that today's civil rights movement, your civil rights movement, is about using the tools of business to figure out what it takes to extend that fundamental assumption that all men are created equal to every human being, man, woman, and child on the planet. And we have the tools to do it. I had the great opportunity of working with Dr. Robert Coles, the child psychologist who was part of desegregating the Southern schools. And he tells this story about working with a young girl, 6 years old, named Ruby Bridges. She was the first African-American girl to go to an all-white school in New Orleans, but in the entire country. And he said that every day he would see Ruby in this beautiful little dress, head held high with great sense of dignity, walking through a phalanx of angry white people screaming at her, calling her a monster. And every day it looked to him like she was talking. And he would say, Ruby, what are you saying to the people? And she would say, Dr. Coles, I'm not saying anything. And finally he said, I see you saying something. What is it that you're saying? And she said, Dr. Coles, I'm not saying anything, I'm praying. And he said, well, then what is it that you're praying? And she said, I'm praying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. At 6 years old, Ruby Bridges had that kind of moral imagination to understand that all of us have angels and monsters inside, and that we need to focus on building systems that allow those deepest yearnings that are inside of each of us for good to flourish. Robert Kennedy said that few of us can have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. And it is in the total of all those acts that the history of this generation will be written. For each of you who are graduating today, I hope that you go and you celebrate and you party and you recognize that you have been with each other on this incredible journey, and in other ways you're just starting. And I hope that you also hold these ideas and these ideals, that much has been given to you and much is expected from you. And finally, I would leave you with the words of the American poet Mary Oliver, who says that in the end, doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, she says, what is it that you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And so I thank you. I bid you great congratulations. And most of all, I wish you Godspeed. The world is counting on you. Thank you.